So this morning I'm going to be doing a little bit different. I'm going to, while I was preparing, things came to me that I wanted to share. And it's going to require me to kind of do a quick survey of chapters 7 through 10 of Mark, because I want you to see the movement of Jesus geographically, because I believe it says something and it helps us to understand what he says that I'm going to focus on. Okay, so can we get that first slide up there, Hunter? There you go. So the title of the message is The New Sheriff. Remember, I've been saying Jesus is the new sheriff in town? The new sheriff is headed for a showdown. That's the title of my message, if you care. So I'm not going to pray because we just prayed and we're all ready to hear from God, right? Yeah. Lord, help us to hear from you. That's my prayer. So you'll remember, I believe in my last message, that Jesus feeds a big crowd. The Pharisees show up. They complain because he's not having people wash their hands, and Jesus basically calls the crowd and says, look, nothing you eat makes you unclean. And that right there is a strike against the Judaic belief of following the law of Moses. Well, if I could get slide 1. Oh gosh, can y'all see that? Okay. Can you enlarge it, or is it stuck like that? Okay, well.
Hunter says you need to work on that.
I'll start covering the whole screen on my end. Hey. So I have Capernaum highlighted in the red, and we believe that that's where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, right? So as soon as that happens, slide 2 please, Jesus travels north to Toure, or some people call it Tyre. It's probably Toure. But anyway, and what I want you to notice, and this is what happened to me, as I'm reading the text, I'm thinking, that's unusual, or at least I thought it was unusual. Jesus travels out of Israel. He leaves Israel to go north, and he's in Syria. Now you see on the map it says Phoenicia, because in the hundreds of years prior to it being Syria, it was known as Phoenicia, and it kept its name even though it was in the Roman province named Syria. So Jesus goes there on the coast. He heals a woman, a Syrian woman. He heals the daughter of a Syrian woman. And so immediately I started thinking, wow, this is really interesting, because as soon as Jesus tells the crowd the food laws, I mean, in effect, Jesus is saying the food laws are not binding on you anymore. Remember, the new sheriff, everything's changing. I'm turning everything upside down. I believe that's what Mark is trying to communicate. And as soon as he gets through with that conflict, he leaves Israel and he's ministering to Gentiles. Okay? It reminds me, and if you remember and you might not, but in my introduction of Mark, the historical tradition we have is that Mark had notes that became his gospel, and he went to Rome and he interviewed Peter, who was in prison under Nero, about to be executed. And the tradition is that he read his notes to Peter, and Peter added his notes and made critique of it, and then Mark took his notes from Peter and Mark's notes, and we got the gospel. So if you think about all that, I immediately think about the vision in the book of Acts where Jesus is telling Peter to go to the centurion's house, Cornelius' house, and Peter goes, well, you know, I've never eaten anything unclean. You remember, and the sheet is dropped in a vision, and Jesus says, don't call unclean what I've called clean. You remember that? 3 times he saw that. And that came to me as I thought about this whole concept that Jesus is moving out of Israel, ministering to Gentiles, and I think Mark's original audience are Romans, and he's wanting to show them that Jesus came for everybody. Wasn't just a Jew reaching the Jews. And if you think about it, there are multiple contact points where Jesus ministers to Gentiles, right? Slide 3, please. After he does his ministry in Syria, he returns to Galilee. and to the Sea of Galilee. You remember last week I talked about that the Sea of Galilee was like a central hub for Jesus, and they used the boat, probably one of Peter's boats, and they were constantly crossing the sea. Well, they returned, and the text says that he went into the Decapolis. The Decapolis is the Roman, well, it actually wasn't a Roman province. It was known as Decapolis because there were 10 cities that were kind of independent, city-states. And Rome did not make them a province. I don't know why. I don't know why. I didn't look it up. But the problem was the Decapolis, 10 cities constantly changed, kind of like the football conferences. They were constantly, some cities were, I don't know, maybe they got mad and they didn't want to pay taxes and they got out of it. It's kind of like the EU almost, and Britain trying to get out of the EU, which you should do. You should get out of the EU. But anyway, so Jesus returns to Galilee and he heals a man. And there's several things that I want to, as I'm walking through this, and I'm going to get on my horse and go fast. He heals a deaf-mute man. And it stood out to me because Mark specifically tells us that Jesus took the man aside. He pulled him out of the crowd and healed him. And then after he heals him, Mark tells us in, I think it's chapter 8, no, it's chapter 7. I can't remember what chapter, but it's verse 36. Jesus commanded the people not to, or told the man, don't tell anyone. And then the Mark says the more he told them not to tell, the more they kept talking about it. Then in chapter 8, and he's still in, we think, he's still in the Decapolis. And by the way, I put the circle there, I guessed. We don't know where he went, but it's somewhere in the Decapolis. Mark records that he feeds another large crowd of 4,000. And wouldn't you know it, the Jews show up again. They're watching him. You know, in the Greco-Roman world, especially in the Jewish world, if some itinerant preacher is known to be feeding a bunch of people, hundreds and hundreds of people out in the middle of nowhere, the first thing you think of is insurrection. Somebody is trying to gather an army to start a coup against the Romans. That's what the Jews probably think, so they're going to check Jesus out, and they demand that he give them a sign, and Jesus basically says, I'm not going to give you a sign. You know, and as I was reading that, I was thinking the nerve of the Pharisees. I mean, he's healing the sick, he's casting out demons, he's miraculously feeding people, and they go, you know what, we'll believe you, but you got to show us a sign. Really? You hadn't seen enough? And I think Jesus basically he's done. And that's what I'm leading to. I think this is a turning point for Jesus. Slide 4. Jesus, as soon as the Jew, this is according to Mark's account, as soon as the Jews are done with that interruption, they cross the Sea of Galilee back to Bethsaida, where Jesus starts ministry again. And you'll remember, Bethsaida is also in the Roman province, not in Israel, and so it's mainly Gentile. And here's what I started thinking when I was, this grabbed my attention. I've never thought of it before. Every time the Pharisees confronted Jesus, he traveled north and got out of Israel. And I started wondering, wow, why is he doing that? And in my mind, I'm thinking that Jesus he knows that he's headed for a showdown, but he's not ready yet. And he's telling people when he heals them, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. You know, and then there's one where he actually tells them, go present yourself to the priest. I think that was his initial, like, put them on notice. But that's what I felt was happening here. But the interesting thing in Bethsaida is he has to pray for the man twice. And that's interesting, right? The first time he prays for him, he's not completely healed. And Jesus prays for him again. And, you know, of course, we think of Jesus, boom, you're healed, that's over, boom. And if you look at all the healings, they're all different. I think Abby talked about the one where he spit and did the mud. Did I remember you saying that? No? I thought I heard somebody talking about that one in one of the past teachings. But look at this in verse 33. Is anybody following the text? What chapter are we in? Verse 23, he took the blind man by the hand.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. He encounters him amongst a bunch of people, and Jesus grabs him by the hand and leads him out of the village to be by himself. And that should tell you something. You know, we I believe, like to call attention to our what we think God is doing, and we want everybody to be healed, we want it to be all dramatic, and here we have the Son of God trying to keep a low profile when he heals people. Isn't that interesting? I find that interesting. And after he heals him, verse 26, he says to the man, you need to go home. Don't even go back to the village. So again, Jesus is keeping this low profile. The next slide, please. Right after that, Jesus takes the disciples again straight north to Syria, to the Roman city, Caesarea Philippi. Again, we're in a Roman province, mainly Gentile. I'm not saying there aren't any Jews, but it's a mainly Gentile province. And we get the famous confession of Peter. And I started thinking, this is where I started really questioning again, as I'm reading through the text. The great confession of Peter is not done in Israel. Does anybody find that striking? I've never noticed it. The great confession where Jesus says, who do the people say I am? Well, some say you're a prophet. Some say maybe you're Elijah. Who do you say I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. In the Mark account, you're the Messiah. And in the other accounts, the Son of the living God. And that great confession by a Jew to the Son of Man happens outside the boundaries of Israel. I just find that amazing. And I think it's part of this big story. As soon as he gives his confession in Mark's gospel, Mark's account, Jesus, for the first time in the book of Mark, predicts his death. Verse 31, he then began to teach the disciples that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. I can't remember, I think it was Nate asked me a couple of weeks ago if I thought the Jews killed Jesus or the Romans. Were you the one who asked me that?
Yes.
Okay, somebody asked me that. I thought it was Nate.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is the Romans actually killed him, but the Jews pushed for it. They pushed for it. And so here we have Jesus for the first time in the gospel telling the disciples, I'm going to have to die. Okay? I'm going to be handed over to the authorities that I've been calling hypocrites. Every time they show up, I've been getting in their face. Those guys are going to have to kill me, but I will rise from the dead. And then Peter says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Jesus, that can't happen. Remember, it's a famous moment where Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And then, immediately after that, Jesus gives a chilling challenge of what it means to be his disciple. Chapter 8, verses 34 and following. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. If we could go to slide 6. Immediately after that, Jesus continues north into the mountain range that includes Mount Hermon. Okay? The text doesn't tell us that. If I don't remember it, unless one of the other gospel accounts does. And then he takes Peter and John up on the mountain range, and he has the occurrence of what we all call the Mount of Transfiguration. Elijah and Moses show up glowing with the glory of God, and Jesus changes in front of the disciples, and he becomes the glory of God. Remember? The Mount of Transfiguration. Verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain, and so again, my thought was, all of this is happening out of Israel. It's not happening in the nation of Israel. And I'd never noticed that. As they're coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had just seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Now, verse 30, Jesus starts back to Galilee so think about it now, after the great confession of Peter and after the Mount of Transfiguration, he heads back south towards Galilee. And Mark tells us, verse 30, that he's trying to stay away from the crowds so he can devote his time to the disciples. Think about it. He has just told them, I'm going to be turned over, I'm going to be killed, and I will rise again. And then, he has this encounter with Peter, and then they have this great event up on the mountain. And, the text doesn't tell us if they come down and tell the other disciples. Jesus told the two guys that went with him, don't tell. If you just saw Jesus turned into glory, and then on the way down he goes, listen, don't tell anybody about this. I don't know about you, but I'd be like, I won't, I promise. And so the other disciples might not even know what happened. But after all of that, Mark tells us that he doesn't want to be around the crowds anymore right now. He wants to devote himself to the disciples. He tells them again for the second time that he has to go to Jerusalem and he has to be killed, but he will rise from the dead. And then in chapter 10, Mark tells us that Jesus is headed to Judea. Several things happen along the way, but then verse 32 of chapter 10 reads like this. They were on their way to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed, the crowds who follow him, were afraid. Now, as I read that, I thought, don't you think when Jesus walked around with the disciples, he was leading the way? In my mind, I'm thinking, are the disciples going to be telling Jesus, hey, let's go over here? I don't know. I envision Jesus always leading the way. In the other gospel accounts, we have the famous text where at this moment, the scripture in one of the gospel accounts, I don't remember which one, says Jesus turned his face like flint to Jerusalem. Anybody remember that? It's a famous verse. That's what's happened here. Jesus is on his way, and that's why I titled this, the new sheriff is headed for a showdown. Here's what I think has happened. He's gotten to the point where he realizes the Pharisees are not going to listen. Now, we can all argue, and look, this is an eternal argument we can have, and I'm not trying to tell you that I'm not trying to tell you I know anything, because there's debate about it. But I'm just thinking, as a man, I'm thinking, or the argument against me would be, well, Jesus knows everything. He knows everything. He knows the Pharisees, and I realize that is an argument. But from a natural human standpoint, I believe, because if he was fully man, there's a really crazy little paradox going on. Fully man, fully God at the same time, right? Here's how I read it. Jesus realizes these guys in Jerusalem are not going to listen. And I'm tired of their stubbornness. He heads north to get away from the crowds. He knows, I think, he is orchestrating the idea that he gives the disciples a chance, and indeed Peter speaks for the rest of them and says, you're the Messiah. How many of us have been around someone who has natural leadership charisma, and they say, this is what we're going to do, and everybody else is like, yeah. That's what I think happens. Peter says, you're the Messiah, and the rest of the disciples are like, that's it. That's right. That's the only good explanation. Now, Jesus has been telling them things that they should have gotten it by now. So Jesus, I think, is like, okay, they got it. And then they go up on the mountain. God makes him this glorified state, and Moses and Elijah appear. One wonders why it's not Enoch and Elijah, and I could go into detail on that, but I'm not going to. But it's interesting because of that. But it's Moses and Elijah, and here's what I think is happening. I think when that happens on the mountain, Jesus basically has it in his heart and in his head, I got to do this. I got to face these guys, and we got to get it on. We got to get it over with. And in my mind, I see Jesus like the guys that landed on the moon. Can't remember what Apollo mission that was. I should know, but I can't remember. And they stuck the flag on the moon. Right? It's kind of like when we've done explorations in Antarctica that are in places that we think no one's ever been. You put your flag down. I think Jesus put his flag down on the mount and said, you know what? And this is to the kingdom of darkness. This is my country. And it's not even in Israel. But it's interesting, right? And there's backstory to that I can't go into, but he jams his flag down and says, no, this is my country, this is my land, I'm the sheriff, and we're about to have it out. Boom. And then he looks at the disciples and says, I'm going to die, let's go. We're going to Jerusalem. Are you with me? They're going to hand me over and I'm going to die. Are you with me? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I think he's the new sheriff in town, and he's headed for Jerusalem for the showdown at the OK Corral. You know, when I was doing my notes, I love the movie Tombstone. And when I was doing my notes, I thought, and I went to YouTube and I Googled, you know, OK Corral Tombstone, and I watched the famous scene of the OK Corral. And I got chill bumps because I'm thinking in my mind, this is what's happening. Jesus he's done. I'm done with this. We got to do this. And so he's challenging the disciples, and it's in this context. It's in this context, and I'm going back to the text that I wanted to focus on. It's in this context where Jesus says, he calls the crowd. You know, initially I thought he just said this to the disciples, and then I checked the text again. He calls the crowd to himself. And he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now look, every Jew knew what the cross was. It was the Romans' worst punishment for anyone who goes against Rome. It was for the worst criminals, but it was also for any political rebel. It was a torturous death. All the Jews knew this. And Jesus is telling the crowd, if you want to follow me, you got to pick up your cross. Because if I'm right, and I'm not saying I am, but I have it in my mind that Jesus has communicated to these guys. Because, I mean, think about it. I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests and I'm going to be killed. But I'm going to rise from the dead. We're going to Jerusalem. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Why are we going to Jerusalem if they're going to kill you? And I think Jesus is saying, it's got to happen. Are you with me? Are you with me? And if you're going to follow me, you got to realize that the potential is here for you to have to follow me on a cross. I think that's what he's saying. Verse 35, if you want to save your life, you're going to lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the sake of the gospel will find it or will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit your soul? Now again, I think it's important that he calls the crowds. These are the crowds that he's been feeding miraculously. Poor people in the countryside who are happy to be fed by the Son of God. They're happy to be healed. They're happy to see a great man moving amongst them. And Jesus is pointing, I think, I don't know if he's pointing his finger, but he's basically saying, look, if you want to follow me, you got to deny yourself. You have to lose your life for my sake. Are you willing to do that? And so that explains to me why Mark says they're on their way to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. I mean, these guys, and it says the disciples are astonished and the others who are following are afraid. I mean, I see Jesus basically, I'm done. I mean, we're going to face this enemy and we're going to do it. And he's looking at the disciples and saying, are you with me? And of course the disciples are saying, yeah, we're with you. Now they eventually, we know what happens, right? They eventually leave. They desert him. Peter says, I'll never leave you. And Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times. You know, but I've prayed for you. And then verse 38, if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him or them when he, the Son of Man, comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. I believe when he says, anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, I could be wrong, I'm not saying I'm right, but in my mind, I think the primary target right there are the Jerusalem leadership who have failed God, who are not taking care of the people. Remember, there's another text in another gospel where it says that they were like sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus was weeping over Israel. I think that's in John's gospel. What does that mean for us, you guys? I mean, I've given you what I believe is the historical context. And I will tell you that in my pastoral past, I have put a lot of emphasis on that text. You know, in Chi Alpha, we're big into discipleship, and we challenge young men and women to give your life. You know, don't just get saved. I mean, even that expression, I want to be saved. I don't want to go to hell, I want to be saved. Well, Jesus is calling us to do more than be saved. He's saying, if you're going to follow me, you got to deny yourself. You got to pick up your cross. You got to face the music, which might not be fun. It might not be good. We sang a couple of songs this morning that spoke to this. What does that mean for us? I think it's different for every individual. I'm not here to try to tell you that you picking up your cross is the same as me picking up mine. Every one of us, it looks a little bit different. Every one of us have different things that God calls us to do. But here's what I believe ultimately it means. Jesus is looking for, and I've talked about this 2 or 3 times in this church, with regard to baptism, with regard to saying the creed, the Apostles' Creed. Jesus is looking for our allegiance. You know, when I was a kid, we did the Pledge of Allegiance every morning in school. We don't do that anymore. I personally think that's tragic. You can do the Pledge of Allegiance every single day in school and still not love your country and serve your country, right? But you are saying, I pledge allegiance. You know, and it's the idea that I'm not going to turn my back on this country. I'm not going to be a, what's it called when you, I'm not going to be a traitor. I'm not going to be treasonous. That's what Jesus is looking for. He's not looking for you to be perfect. He knows you're not going to be perfect. He's not looking for you to walk it out perfectly. He knows you're not going to do that. But what he is looking for is the heart that says, God, I'm with you. Jesus says, are you with me? And he's looking for you to say, yes. I'm a little scared. I don't know if I can do it. I'm fearful that you're going to ask me to do something I don't want to do. But I really want to be with you, Jesus. I really want to be with you. That's what he's looking for. How that plays out in your life, how that plays out in my life is going to be different. Because we're at different places on our journey with him. What it looks like for me now is radically different from what it looked like before I got married. I mean, I was kind of crazy. I was known to do things that were a bit out of the ordinary in my desire to be obedient to Christ. Once I got married, and especially once I had kids, I had to backtrack a little bit. You know, I couldn't pick up hitchhikers at 2 o'clock in the morning anymore. Did I trust God? Yes. But I had 2 small children at home with a wife, and if some guy blows my brains out, what am I going to do for my family? You know what I mean? So I had to start being a little more sober in what I thought it meant for me. But I'm still committed to this text. I'm still committed to the call of Jesus in my life. Will you follow me? Will you deny your life? Will you deny your dreams, your desires, the things you want in life? Anybody who knows me knows I wanted to teach at the university. God let me do it for 6 years, took it away from me. Remember we sing that song, He gives and takes away? Easy to sing till He takes something away from you. But remember that song, my heart is still to say, blessed be your name. And that's what he's looking for, is our allegiance. Whatever that means for you. And I can't tell you what it means. It's going to be different for each person. It's going to be different as you walk it out. It changes. But I believe the call is still there. Jesus is looking for men and women who will say, I will follow you. I want to be obedient to you. He's looking for men and women who are willing to be obedient to him. If he asks you to do something that's a little out of the ordinary, he's looking for men and women who will say, I'll do it. My family's going to think I'm crazy, but I'll do it. It might mean that I don't have the wonderful American dream. But if that's the way you lead me, Lord Jesus, I'll do it. I want to know it's you. I want you to help me know it's you. But if you help me see it's you, I will do it. And that's the challenge that I believe exists for every one of us to this day. It's a little different from when Jesus said it to the original guys, because they were literally going into battle, right? They were going into like an army, like a platoon. They were going into a firefight where they might lose their life. Well, we're not in that context. But let me tell you this. I knew a man who was a pastor in Cuba when the communists took over Cuba. And I sat and listened to him weeping tell me how he had felt like he failed God because he fled in the night. He grabbed his family and fled in the night, jumped on a boat and hit it to Miami, while many of his friends stayed and were tortured, imprisoned, and some killed. We read about Watchman Nee and the communist takeover in China, and he lived the rest of his life in prison. That's not likely to happen to any of us here. But my challenge to you and my belief is that Jesus is still pointing his, I don't know if he's pointing his finger, I'm bad about pointing my finger, but he's looking you in the eye and he's saying, will you follow me? Will you count the cost and follow me? Don't give me excuses. I know it's not going to be easy. I know you're not going to do it perfectly. I know you're going to fail at points. But I want to know, do you want it? Do you want to follow me with all your heart as best you can? And that's what he's calling you to do. Let's pray. Jesus, help us. Help us. Lord, we sing to you. We love it when you heal. We love it when you work in our lives and make things good, make things better. We love it when you provide for our needs. We thank you for all of that. But dear Jesus, help us not be the people who are just wanting to take from you. Help us be your son or daughter who's willing to respond to you. Yes, I will follow you. Help me. Help me. But if you'll help me, Lord, I will. I will do what you want from me. Please help me. I ask you, God, to speak to everyone here. Help us. We need you to help us. I know my brothers and sisters want to do this. But I also know that we need your help. And we're throwing ourselves at your mercy and your grace. And we're saying, Lord, please help us. We want to walk with you. We want to follow you. We want to be able to deny ourselves, pick up our cross, whatever that means. But we need your help. I pray, Holy Spirit, that you will help us. Help us to be faithful. Jesus. Just take a second right there where you sit. In your heart, just talk to God for a minute. Talk to Jesus for a minute about this. Jesus, help us. Help us, Jesus. Just want to encourage you, if you feel a struggle to do this, talk to somebody. You can talk to me, you can talk to anybody, any friend that you feel like you can, but talk to someone. Get someone to pray with you. I've been asked numerous times, why don't I do altar calls? I don't typically do altar calls. Quite frankly, I think that, every Sunday, I don't know about you guys, but during worship, I was sitting right there having an altar call. I was wrestling with God about just me and what I need from Him and my life in front of Him. And that's where our altar needs to be anyway, is internal. So I'm not big on, making people get up and walk. I came to Christ sitting in a car on a driveway with one other guy, and I didn't know beans about what I was doing either. I just said, I need you, Jesus, in my life. I had no idea. If He had challenged me with this message, I think I would have still accepted it, but it would have been a lot more, oh, really? So I don't intend this to be, I knew coming in, you guys know this isn't something I do every week, this kind of message. But that's why I like teaching through the Scriptures. This text demands some kind of viewing, some kind of response, right? I don't think you can glibly pass over this famous text where Jesus is calling us to Himself in commitment. But I also want each of you to know, I need you to know, I'm not sitting here casting judgment, okay? That's not the way it works. I think I was clear about that. It's going to look different for each one of us. Just real quickly, does anybody have something to share? We're not going to do we're not going to do much time right here unless someone has something you need to share, you want to say. Anybody? Okay. Well, Hannah, you go first.
I was thinking about, you said, why not Enoch? And I was thinking about the roles that Moses and Elijah played. And they were not only prophets that had really personal connections with God, they were warriors and went out and slaughtered people in God's name. And that's what Jesus was supposed to do when He came back, was this warrior. And so I was wondering,
Hannah, that's good.
That is awesome.
That's really good. I never thought of that one. And you were wondering, sorry.
But that's what Jesus was supposed to be to the Jewish people, was this prince, a warrior prince.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe them seeing the two warrior prophets was their realization that, yes, this is our warrior prince that has come back.
Yeah, and isn't it bizarre that he's not going to take up arms? That was the big...
In a different way.
Yeah, that was the big struggle, is that people wanted him to do another Maccabean revolt where it just wipes out the Romans. And that's, honestly, he was more about, my opinion, he was more about taking out the Jewish leadership because he thought they were corrupted. So, but that's a great observation. Ethan.
You referenced the song.
That's why I like to do comments.
Yeah.
That never came into my mind. That was great.
This isn't quite as a revelation, but you referenced the song "Blessed Be Your Name," and it says that my heart will choose to say. Right, that word "choose" makes all the difference, and there's nothing about us that is innately better or stronger than anyone else. It's all about our choice to go before God, to show our brokenness, and realizing that He can do more with our broken, half whatever self than we can with all of our strength, right? And it's that impacted me really hard. You got to choose all the time. It's up to you. He's going to use you. So.
Okay. Anybody else before we go?